It was in the first week of February, in that raw interval of the London year when the very daylight seems to come ashore unwillingly, that I found myself once more ensconced in the familiar armchair beside the fire in Baker Street. The room was cheerful enough, with ink-coal crackling, the Persian slipper on the mantel, the chemical corner in its usual disorder, yet beyond the curtains one could feel the city crouched and muttering under its blanket of fog. Holmes lay at full length upon the sofa, his long, nervous frame relaxed to the point of languor. Though I had learned by bitter experience that his idleness was often no more than the stillness of a cat at a mouse-hole. The thin, aquiline face was turned toward the ceiling. The gray eyes, half closed, held that peculiar introspective look which meant that his mind, like some swift engine, was already thundering along invisible rails. I had been reading to him, at his request, from the morning's papers. It was a routine which, despite his affected contempt for journalistic sensationalism, he insisted upon when the work ran thin. More than once I had observed him glean from the smallest paragraph the germ of an inquiry which Scotland Yard, for all its boasting, had failed even to perceive. On this particular morning my eye was arrested by a modest announcement, printed without emphasis and tucked away between a report of a fire in Bermondsey and a list of bankruptcies. St. Etheldreda's, Holborn. Yesterday the remains of Mr. Julius Beddington, solicitor, late of Lincoln's Inn Fields, were interred. The deceased was a gentleman of repute in his profession and leaves a widow. It was the sort of notice one reads without reading. I might have passed it, but for the line which followed, set off with a dash as though the compositor himself had hesitated. A peculiar incident is rumored to have occurred at the graveside, the details of which are not yet public. Holmes' eyes opened. "You hesitate, Watson?" said he. "It is nothing," I answered, annoyed to find my attention detected so readily. "Merely a vague line about some disturbance at a funeral." Holmes held out his hand for the paper. He read the paragraph, then the surrounding columns, with a swiftness that seemed almost careless. Yet I knew that he was weighing each word as an assayer weighs gold dust. "St. Etheldreda's," he murmured. "Holborn, Old Church. Roman Catholics used it once. Narrow lanes, a solicitor of Lincoln's Inn Fields. And a peculiar incident rumored, which means that someone has gone to the press but has been muzzled." He tossed the paper aside. "Your conclusion?" I asked. "That the incident is not merely peculiar, but profitable to someone," said Holmes. "If it were merely grotesque, the reporter would have it in full with adjectives. If it were merely scandalous, society would have it in whispers. But when it is profitable, dangerous someone pays for silence. You take a funeral notice very seriously." "I take any notice seriously when it is badly written," said he, with that odd smile which meant that his mind had already chosen its path. "Bad writing, Watson, is the outward and visible sign of inward confusion." Before I could make reply, there came the sharp tap of the landlady's step upon the stair, and Mrs. Hudson's voice, discreet yet urgent. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it's a matter of life and death, and he looks as if he'd seen a ghost." Holmes rose in a single smooth movement, the lassitude falling from him like a cloak. "Show him up." A moment later our visitor entered, and the first glance at him was enough to convince me that Mrs. Hudson's phrase had not been mere melodrama. He was a man of perhaps 50, heavily built, yet now shrunken in upon himself, as though the bones had suddenly become too large for the flesh. His cheeks were gray, his eyes were red-rimmed and restless. He carried his hat in both hands, crushing the brim unconsciously, and in the damp of his overcoat one could read the tale of a hurried journey through the fog. Holmes, with that curious quickness which seemed to be a form of sight beyond my own, watched him as a naturalist watches a rare insect. "Pray take the chair by the fire," said he. "You have been standing in the cold. Dr. Watson, you know, is a man of medicine. If your case is truly of life and death, his presence will not be an intrusion." The man stared at me, then at Holmes, and gave a short laugh which had no mirth in it. "Life and death," he repeated. "Yes, and worse than both." He sat, leaned forward, and spoke with abruptness, as if afraid that if he did not force the words out, they would choke him. "My name is Silas Crowninshield. I am God help me the sexton at St. Etheldrada's church." Holmes inclined his head, as if the name confirmed something already half suspected. "It concerns the burial yesterday," continued our visitor. "Mr. Julius Beddington." "You may have read—" "We have," said Holmes. "There was a peculiar incident. I should like the details without rumor." Silas Crowninshield swallowed. His throat worked as if it pained him. "The body was still warm," he whispered. Holmes' expression did not change. Mine did. In spite of myself, for the phrase had in it something so stark and unnatural that it seemed to chill the room. "Warm?" said Holmes, very quietly. "Aye, warm," said the sexton, with a sort of stubborn terror, as if he clung to that one fact, because it was the strangest thing he had ever known. "I've handled the dead since I was a lad. I know what cold flesh is. I know the weight of it, the feel of it, the way the joints stiffen. But this was not like any corpse I've carried." Holmes sat down opposite him, his fingertips together, his gaze intent. "Proceed," said he. Silas drew a long breath. "It began with the coffin," said he. "Not the common sort. A handsome thing. Dark wood, brass fittings, a fine plate with his name and dates. The undertaker's men brought it in the morning. I was in the vestry when they set it down, and I heard one of them swear soft-like, under his breath, because he'd near dropped his end." "It was heavy," said Holmes. "Heavy as sin," said Silas. "Yet it should not have been. Mr. Beddington was a thin gentleman, so they said, wasted from a chest complaint. The widow Mrs. Beddington's she came behind, veiled, and two other gentlemen with her, respectable-looking, with black gloves and faces like stone. One was Mr. Horace Lyle, a partner from the same firm in Lincoln's Inn Fields, Beddington and Lyle. I know him, for he has family graves there and has dealings with the parish." Holmes' eyes flickered. "And the other?" "I didn't know him," said Silas. "Tall, clean-shaven. Carried himself like a soldier, though he wore no uniform. He never spoke. He watched everything. Lestrange's invisible silhouette seemed suddenly to hover in my imagination. Those silent observers so often being the agents of one department or another. Yet Silas' manner suggested not official watchfulness, but something colder. "The service was proper," he continued. "A short one, for the widow was distressed and the day was bitter. Then we went to the yard. The grave was ready. The undertaker's men had the ropes. We lowered the coffin, steady enough. It went down true, and then his voice broke. Then I heard it." "What did you hear?" asked Holmes. "A sound from inside," whispered Silas. "A muffled knock, like a hand door, something striking wood from within." I confess that my own hand tightened upon the arm of my chair. Holmes' face remained composed, but his pupils had contracted in that way I knew so well a sign, not of fear, but of sharpened attention. "You are certain it came from within the coffin?" said he. "As certain as I am that I sit here," said Silas fiercely. "I thought at first it was the ropes creaking, or the boards shifting. But then it came again 3 times, slow, knock dash knock dash knock dot. And the others heard it." "They must have," said Silas. "For one of the undertaker's men went white as chalk. He looked at his mate, and his mate stared down at the coffin as if he'd seen hell open. Mrs. Beddington swayed, and Mr. Lyle caught her. The tall, silent gentleman, he stepped forward quick, and he said in a low voice, 'Finish it. Finish it.' Holmes repeated aye, and one of the men he didn't want to. I could see it, but the other tugged the rope, and down it went the last foot. and the earth was shoveled in. Mr. Lyle gave the first spadeful, as is custom, and then the men set to, faster than I've ever seen. They filled it in near running. Holmes' voice was as calm as ever. "And you, what did you do?" I froze," said Silas in misery. "It's shameful to say, but I froze. I've been in churchyards at midnight and heard things that turned my blood cold. Foxes, cats, boys playing tricks. But this was a man's knock, I swear it. And the coffin. The coffin was still warm. The air about it, when it was lowered past me, had a kind of living heat." Holmes' eyes moved to the coal fire, as though he saw in it some image. "After the burial," said he, "what then?" Silas licked his lips. "When they were gone, I waited," he said. "I told myself it was my fancy. The mind does queer things with fog and grief. But all the evening I could not settle. And at night, after the church was locked and the lane was quiet, I went out with a lantern. To the grave." "Said one, 'Yes, sir,'" said the sexton, looking at me as if seeking absolution from a doctor's face. "I know it's not right, but I had to know. I took a spade from the shed, and I began to dig." Holmes leaned forward imperceptibly. "You dug up the coffin." "I did," whispered Silas. "It took me near 2 hours, sweating like a beast, and all the while I thought I'd hear a shout behind me or a hand on my shoulder. But no one came. And when I got down to the lie, prized it up." He stared at the flames now, his eyes wide and fixed, as though the scene played again upon the fire's surface. "It was empty," he said. A silence fell, one of those heavy silences in which every small sound becomes magnified. I heard the faint tick of the clock upon the mantel and the soft hiss of coal. Holmes did not move. "Empty," said he at last. "Empty," repeated Silas. "No body, no shroud. Nothing but a little dampness at the bottom, and a smell like camphor or spirits. The lining was neat. The plate was right. The screws had not been touched. It had been sealed at the undertaker's, and yet there was no dead man within." Holmes' gaze remained steady. "Did you look for signs of tampering? A false bottom? A side panel?" Silas shook his head. "I ran my hands over it," he said. "I knocked the boards. It was solid. I even crawled in and felt the corners like a lunatic. There was nowhere for a body to be hidden. It was," he shuddered, "as if the coffin had never held one at all." "And you replaced it?" "Refilled the grave." "I did," said Silas hoarsely. "Because what else could I do? I'm a poor man. If I went to the police, they'd say I'd been drinking, or I'd robbed the grave. They'd put me in jail. But then, this morning, I found he broke off and fumbled in his coat. His fingers shook so that it took him several attempts to draw out a small object wrapped in a scrap of paper. At the edge of the grave, where I dug," said he, "caught in the clay." He held it out. Holmes took the paper, opened it delicately, and disclosed a small fragment of something pale and fibrous. At first glance, I took it for a shred of cloth. Then I saw that it was not woven. Holmes lifted it to his nose, then to the light. "A shaving," said he, "from a plant fiber. Hemp, possibly, or jute." And he held it closer. "With a trace of resinous substance." Silas stared, bewildered. "I don't know what it is," he said. "Only that I found it where no such thing should be." Holmes' eyes, for a brief instant, met mine over the little fragment. There was in them that spark of restrained excitement which never failed to stir me. "And you have told no one else?" Holmes asked the sexton. "No one," said Silas. "But I can't keep it. Not when I think," he pressed a hand to his brow. "What if he was alive? What if I, God forgive me, helped to bury a living man? And if he wasn't, if he never was there, then where's Mr. Beddington? And what have they done with him?" Holmes rose. "You have done very wisely to come," said he. This is a matter which may indeed concern life and death. It also concerns something else which you have not yet understood: motive. A coffin is not emptied for amusement. There is gain in it, or concealment. We shall go to St. Etheldreda's at once." He turned to me. "Watson, your boots, your revolver, and bring that thick coat you dislike. The fog of Holborn is not a thing to trifle with." In the briskness of his tone, the case had already taken shape for him. Yet to me it remained a nightmare of contradictions, warmth where there should be cold, knocks from a coffin that held no corpse, and the chill implication that somewhere in London Julius Beddington was either walking when he should have been lying, or lying where no one had thought to look. As we descended the stairs, Holmes paused long enough to speak one final sentence to our shaken client. "Mr. Crowninshield," said he, "you will do exactly as I instruct. You will return to your churchyard and behave as if nothing has occurred. If anyone asks, you know nothing. And if the tall gentleman should come again," he smiled thinly, "you will observe his boots." Silas blinked. "His boots, sir?" "Always the boots," said Holmes, and with that he swept out into the yellow-gray London morning, leaving me to follow with that familiar mingling of admiration and unease which his case is so often inspired. For when a coffin is empty and the body still warm, one begins to suspect that death itself has been outwitted on that, in London at least. The cleverer criminals are those who learn to imitate the grave. We reached Holborn by cab through a London that seemed made of damp wool and blurred lamplight, the wheels hissing over the slick stones while the driver peered forward as if into a pale sea. Holmes sat opposite me, motionless save for the quick, occasional lift of his nostrils, as though the fog itself were a chemical he meant to analyze. Our companion, Crowninshield, rode upon the small seat beside the driver, and more than once I saw his shoulders jerk at some inward recollection. It was only when we turned into the narrower ways near Ely Place that Holmes spoke. "You observed the undertaker's man who blanched," said he. "You noted which hand he used to wipe his brow." I confessed that I had noted nothing of the sort. "He used his left," Holmes returned, "and therefore his right was occupied at the very instant when the knocks were heard. That does not absolve him, Watson, but it narrows the field. Most of investigation is the art of excluding what need not be considered." His eyes traveled to Crownshield's back. "Our friend is a sober man. His fear is not that of imagination, but of memory." The cab drew up near the ancient church, crouched like a blackened relic amid clerks, offices, and small shops. St. Etheldreda's had the air of having endured England's centuries by the stubbornness of stone, and the graveyard beside it was a cramped patch of earth, ringed by railings which the fog reduced to a mere suggestion of iron teeth. Crowninshield led us in by a side gate, his key clicking like a guilty thing in the lock. The yard smelt of wet soil and old leaves. The headstones, leaning at odd angles, emerged and vanished as the fog shifted, so that one might fancy oneself in a field of drowned men. "Here," whispered the sexton, and halted by a mound of fresh-turned earth whose darkness was still raw against the pallid winter grass. Holmes went down upon one knee without hesitation, heedless of mud, and began to examine the ground with a minuteness which would have seemed absurd had I not known how often the fate of men had hung upon such absurdities. He drew a lens from his pocket, held it close to the clay at the grave's edge, and for some minutes did not speak. I watched his long fingers trace the lip of the disturbed earth, and saw him pluck away a tiny clod and crumble it thoughtfully. "You dug from this side?" said he at last, without looking up. Crowninshield started. "Aye, sir, how?" "Because you are right-handed," Holmes answered, "and the spade marks show a stronger pressure upon the outer stroke. Also, you were in haste at the end." He rose, brushed his knee with a quick slap, and walked slowly round the grave as a hound circles a covert. Twice he halted, and once he looked up sharply at the railing. where a smear of clay clung to the iron. He touched it, then turned to me. "Someone else has been here since last night," said he. "A man who did not dig, but who leaned hard upon that bar to look down. He had clay upon his boot, and he brushed it off there. Then he knows," I cried. "Or suspects," said Holmes. "Knowledge is a weight, Watson. Suspicion is a lever. Either may be used." We entered the church by a small door, and Crown and Shield's lantern threw a wavering circle over stone flags and dark pews. The place was cold, yet there was a faint sweetness in the air, like incense long ago. Holmes moved straight to the vestry, where the sexton showed us the very spot upon which the coffin had rested. "It stood here," he said, and his voice trembled. Holmes's gaze went to the boards, to the skirting, to the base of the wall. "You scrub?" he remarked suddenly. Crown and Shield stared. "Every Friday, sir. Not recently," Holmes returned. He knelt, and with the edge of his penknife scraped at a seam where board met board. A pale, glistening fleck came away upon the blade. He held it near the lantern. "Resin," said he. "And here fibers?" He produced from his pocket the scrap Crown and Shield had given us and compared it with what he had lifted from the floor. For an instant the light caught his eyes, and I saw that quick inward leap which in him meant certainty. "Jute," he murmured. "Sacking. And spirits camphor or chloroform, perhaps used to mask a smell or to confuse a nose." He rose and, to my astonishment, put his face close to the boards and inhaled like a man sampling wine. "Not chloroform," he said. "More bitter. Something employed by undertakers and yet not common." We had not been 10 minutes in the vestry when steps sounded outside and a man's voice, brisk, official, rang through the passage. "Crown and Shield. Open up, will you? I'm freezing out here." The sexton went as white as the marble effigy in the nave. Holmes's hand touched his sleeve light, controlling. "Do as you were told," he whispered. "Naturalness, above all." Crown and Shield opened the door and admitted Inspector Lestrade, whose keen ferret face sharpened further when he saw Holmes. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he cried, "I might have known. The yard gets a whiff of something queer in a churchyard, and there you are, like a rat catcher at the first squeak." Holmes smiled languidly. "Your metaphor does you credit," said he. Lestrade stamped the mud from his boots and glanced from one to the other of us. "We've had a pretty morning," said he. "Beddington's widow in hysterics, undertaker swearing he delivered the corpse proper, and half the clerks in Lincoln's Inn whispering about grave robbers. There's talk of a scandal papers sniffing round." And then his eyes narrowed. "There's Crown and Shield, who looked like he'd swallowed his own lantern when I spoke to him." Holmes drifted towards the door as if to leave the vestry. Yet in truth he placed himself so that Lestrade's view of the floorboards was cut off. "You are investigating, then?" he asked. "Investigating?" Lestrade snorted. "What's to investigate? Either the coffin was stolen after burial grave robbers or the undertaker pulled a trick. And I've got men on both." Holmes's gaze flickered to Lestrade's boots splashed with clay upon the left instep. For the briefest moment, Lestrade's confident mask wavered, as if he sensed rather than saw the scrutiny. "Before you commit the yard to either theory," said Holmes softly, "you might consider a third, that no body ever entered the coffin at all." Lestrade barked a laugh. "And the knocks, Mr. Holmes?" "Ghosts, is it?" Holmes's face grew suddenly hard. "Knocks can be manufactured," said he. "So can grief, and so can evidence. I am not interested in ghosts, Lestrade. I am interested in men." At that, he turned as though the matter bored him. Yet I knew by the stillness in his shoulders that his mind had moved another step. As we stepped out again into the fog, he spoke low to me. "Observe Lestrade's left instep," he said. He leaned upon the rail. Holmes did not return at once to Baker Street. Instead, he let me, with that unhurried decisiveness which always suggested that time itself was one of his instruments. through a succession of narrow passages and black archways until we came out upon a broader street, where the fog thinned to a dirty gauze. "We have learned enough at St. Etheldreda's," said he. "Not of the crime, but of the attitude of the official mind toward it. Lestrade has decided upon grave robbers because it is a familiar villainy. He will pursue familiarity until the unfamiliar trips him. I ventured that the inspector, at least, had energy. Energy is not intelligence," Holmes returned. "It is merely the fuel. Observe how his boot acquired clay only on the left instep. He leaned with his weight there because he was impatient, and impatience makes men careless. The other man who leaned upon the rail did so with deliberation. He looked down, not up. He returned to measure what had been disturbed. That man is of more interest." We stopped before a low-fronted establishment whose window displayed plumes, shrouds, and the grim splendors of mourning. A bell tinkled as we entered, and at once the peculiar odor of such places met my nostrils, the mingled perfume of varnish, wax, damp cloth, and some sharp preservative which pricked at the eyes. Behind the counter, a pale young man with side whiskers rose from a ledger and looked at us with the guarded civility of one accustomed to sorrow and suspicious of levity. Holmes's manner changed. The languor fell away. In its place came that easy, almost careless geniality which made him, when he chose, the most convincing of companions. "Mr. Pritchard, I believe," said he. "I am a friend of Mr. Horace Lyle's. A most distressing business, this death of poor Beddington." The man's gaze sharpened at the name. "Mr. Lyle has not been in," he said cautiously. No, Holmes replied. "It is not Mr. Lyle I come for. It is Mr. Beddington's coffin. A very fine piece of work. I have an interest in workmanship. One does not often see such brass fitting in Holborn." The young man's pride struggled with his reserve. "It was a special commission," he admitted, "paid for in advance." "By the widow?" asked Holmes lightly. "By Mr. Lyle," said the clerk. "He came himself. He was particular about the plate. Wanted a deep cut." Holmes nodded, as though such details delighted him. "And the lining." "White satin," said the clerk, warming, "with a jute underlay for stiffness." Holmes's eyelids flickered, but his tone remained casual. "Jute, indeed. One must keep costs reasonable, even in grief. And the preserving preparations." I noticed assent. The clerk hesitated. "Common practice, sir," he said. "A little carbolic, a little camphor. Keeps things respectable if the burial is delayed." "Was it delayed?" asked Holmes. "No," said the clerk quickly, "too quickly." Holmes's smile did not alter, yet I felt the invisible pressure of his attention. "Then you used it out of abundance of caution," he murmured. "A prudent man." "Prudence is rare." He leaned nearer, as though confiding. "You will forgive me, Mr. Pritchard, but my friend Mr. Lyle is anxious about rumors. People say foolish things, grave robbers, and such. It would be a pity if it were known that the coffin was unusually heavy." The clerk's face changed. "Heavy," he repeated. "It was a fair weight for a thin consumptive," said Holmes softly. The clerk's eyes darted past us to the door, as if he expected someone to enter. "The men complained," he confessed at last. "But coffins vary, sir." "The wood was thick," Mr. Lyle insisted. "Insisted," said Holmes, and I heard in the single word his satisfaction at confirming a thread. "And where was the body prepared?" Holmes continued. "At the deceased's house." "No," said the clerk. "At our rooms behind. Mr. Lyle brought a doctor's certificate and the papers. He said the widow could not bear it in the house." Holmes sighed sympathetically. "Poor lady. And you saw the body?" The clerk's mouth tightened. "It is not usual you are a man of discretion," Holmes interrupted smoothly. "Yet you are also a man of conscience. If there is trouble, it will fall upon the undertaker's clerk before it touches a solicitor of Lincoln's Inn." The words were mild, but they struck home. The young man's cheeks flushed. "I saw enough," he said. "It was wrapped. The face was covered. By whose hand?" asked Holmes. "By Mr. Lyle's," said the clerk, and now there was fear in his voice. "He was there throughout. He never left it alone with us. He said there were disfigurements from illness." Holmes straightened and took up his hat. "Thank you, Mr. Pritchard," said he. "You have been most helpful. If any gentleman should call and ask what we spoke of, you will say that I admired your workmanship and nothing more." The clerk swallowed. "And if the police—" "The police," said Holmes, with a faint curl of the lip, "will ask the wrong questions." We stepped out again into the street, and the fog seemed fresher after the sweet, corrupt air within. Holmes walked a little way in silence, his hands behind his back, his head bowed. "So," said he at last, "a coffin lined with satin over jute, treated with camphor and carbolic, ordered and supervised by Mr. Horace Lyle, and containing a body which no employee was permitted to see. Add to that the reported knocks which are easily produced by any mechanism placed within a hollow space. It is not death that is mysterious, Watson. It is identity." I protested that if the coffin was empty, then the body had been removed, or never inserted. Holmes answered, "The warmth Crown and Shield felt may be explained by something else entirely. A hot stone, a chemical reaction, a bladder of heated water. Such tricks are old as theater." He glanced sideways at me. "Do you recall my little lecture upon the difference between observation and conjecture? You have conjectured a living burial. I observe a designed illusion. We took a cab to Lincoln's Inn Fields. The great square lay somber under the winter sky, its bare trees like black ink strokes upon gray paper. Beddington and Lyle occupied sober chambers with polished brass and a door which spoke of prosperity. A clerk admitted us to a waiting room heavy with law books and respectability. Presently, Mr. Horace Lyle entered, a tall man with ironed mustaches and eyes that smiled without warmth. He greeted Holmes with the easy recognition of one who had expected him. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I am not surprised. London has but one mind for oddities." "Oddities have but one London," returned Holmes, and they bowed like fencers. Lyle's gaze went to me, measured and dismissed. "How may I assist you?" he asked. Holmes's voice became almost bored. "By telling me why you ordered a coffin in secret, insisted upon camphor, forbade your own undertaker's men to view the deceased, and then hurried the burial when a sound quite capable of being manufactured issued from within." Lyle did not start. That in itself was startling. Only a slight tightening at the corner of his mouth betrayed him. "You make accusations," he said. "I make statements," Holmes replied. "The difference is that mine are true." Lyle's eyes hardened. "My partner is dead," said he. "His widow is ill. I will not have her tormented by ghoulish fancies." Holmes leaned forward. "Then relieve us of fancies by giving us facts. Where is Julius Beddington?" For the first time, Lyle's composure wavered, and in that instant I saw something behind his lawyer's maska, flash of calculation, swift and cold. He recovered himself at once. "In his grave," said he. "As you very well know." Holmes rose. "Then," said he quietly, "we shall dig him up again only, this time in daylight, with the police and the newspapers watching. Unless, Mr. Lyle, you prefer to tell me what you have done with the man you buried in name." Lyle's threat of publicity had been met by Holmes's threat of daylight, and for perhaps the first time in our acquaintance I saw a solicitor of standing look, as though the very foundations of his world had shifted beneath his well-polished boots. Yet the man's self-command was remarkable. He drew a long breath, rang a small bell upon his desk, and when the clerk appeared, he dismissed him with a brief instruction to admit no one. Then he rose and closed the inner door with his own hand, turning the key and slipping it into his pocket as if we were not guests, but witnesses. "You force me into an intolerable position, Mr. Holmes," said he, his voice low and controlled. "You speak of newspapers as though they were scalpels. They are bludgeons. A rumor can ruin a firm as surely as embezzlement." Expression remained as indifferent as a man examining a specimen in a jar. "Then you will find it profitable to speak plainly," said he. "You have already gambled with rumor by permitting one to exist." Lyle stood with his back to the fireless grate, the gray light from the window picking out the lines at his eyes. "My partner is dead," he said. "Of that you may be certain. Julius Beddington died on Monday night." "Where?" asked Holmes. "In his country house near Harrow," said Lyle. "He had been unwell for months. Consumption, as you heard. I went to see him on Monday afternoon to have him sign certain papers. He was weak, but lucid. At 9 o'clock I received a message from his servant that he had taken a turn. By the time I arrived, shortly after 10, he was gone. Who saw him dead?" I asked. Lyle's eyes flicked to me with annoyance, then back to Holmes. "A local doctor, Dr. Arkwright. He signed the certificate." Holmes's fingers drummed once upon the chair arm. "You will give me the address. I will give you anything." "Reasonable," said Lyle sharply. "But I will not have my dead partner dragged through a public inquest because a sexton fancies he heard a knock." Holmes's head inclined a fraction. "We shall come to the knock presently. Continue." Lyle hesitated, and I could see the struggle in him between pride and necessity. At last he spoke with a bitterness that seemed aimed as much at himself as at us. "There were papers," said he, "a will and a codicil. Julius had no children. His fortune was in the practice and in certain investments which I had managed for him. He distrusted his wife's relatives. He meant to leave the bulk to a charitable trust, his own notion, not mine, and he meant to leave his widow an income. But on Monday afternoon, when I brought the codicil, he altered." "Altered how?" asked Holmes. "He refused to sign," said Lyle. "He said." The solicitor's lips tightened. "He said he had discovered something I had done." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And had you?" Lyle's face flushed, then paled. "In business," he said, "one makes decisions. Some succeed, some fail. Julius had always left such matters to me. Yet at the end, when his mind was poisoned by fear, he chose to believe I had betrayed him. He accused me of misappropriating funds." Holmes leaned forward, suddenly alive. "Accused you to whom?" "To me alone," said Lyle. "He dismissed the servants. He raved. He said he would expose me, that he had proof. He clutched at a dispatch case beside the bed and would not let it go. Then his coughing came on frightfully, and he grew weak. When I left him alive, Watson, alive, he still had that case." Holmes's voice was very quiet. "When you returned at 10, the case was gone." Lyle's eyelids flickered. "Yes." "And the body's face was covered." "Yes." "And you supervised the coffin." "Yes." Holmes rose and walked to the window, looking out upon the square where figures moved like smudges in the fog. "You are not a murderer, Mr. Lyle," said he, as if commenting upon the weather. The solicitor's composure cracked. "Not a murderer," he repeated hoarsely. "Then what am I, sir?" "A man pursued by the consequences of a moment's weakness. When I found him dead, the servant said he had asked for brandy and been given it. The doctor spoke of heart failure. Yet I, God help me, remembered his accusations. I remembered that case, and I thought of scandal, of the firm, of my wife and children, of prison." Holmes turned, and his gray eyes held the man pinned. "So you removed the case?" "I did," whispered Lyle. "I admit it." I searched the room and found it under the mattress. I took it. Attained papers, ledgers, things I did not understand at first, but enough to know that Julius believed them proof. I burned some. I kept others. Then, to avoid any whisper of theft, I arranged the burial myself. I paid the undertaker in cash. I told them the body was disfigured. I wrapped it. I meant only to protect myself from a dying man's delusions. And the coffin was empty, said Holmes, each word a step closing on its prey. Lyle's mouth opened, but no sound came. His hands clenched at his sides. Empty, he echoed at last. That is impossible. Holmes's face showed, for the first time, a trace of impatience. It is possible, and it is fact. Your partner is not in that grave. Either you buried the wrong thing, or someone saw your precautions and used them. A slow horror rose in Lyle's eyes. Used them, he repeated, as though tasting poison. Then Julius Holmes cut him short. Julius is dead, said he. But his death may be only the smallest part of this affair. Tell me of the other man at the funeral, the tall one who watched. Lyle's shoulders sagged. I hired him, he confessed. A man named Stapleton. He came recommended by an agency as discreet security. I feared the widow's brother, Edwin Harrowby. He is a wastrel. Julius despised him. I thought he might cause trouble at the burial or attempt to seize papers. Stapleton was to prevent any disturbance, and did he? Holmes. He urged haste, said Lyle, his voice dull now. When the knocking was heard, he leaned in and said, "Finish it." I assumed he meant to spare the widow a scene. Holmes's gaze drifted to the key in Lyle's pocket. Where is this Stapleton now? I do not know, said Lyle. He took his pay and vanished. Holmes stepped close, and his voice dropped until it was scarcely more than a breath. Then you have hired the fox to guard the henhouse. There is a reason the coffin was heavy, Mr. Lyle. There is a reason for jute and preservative. There is a reason for a face covered and for men not allowed to see. Someone needed a convincing funeral without the inconvenience of a corpse. I felt a chill despite the stuffy room. But for what end? I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. To make the world believe Julius Beddington was safely under the earth, said he, while something of far greater value than his body, his dispatch case, his knowledge, his signature, or his secrets could be handled elsewhere. Lyle made a sudden movement as if to seize Holmes's arm. Then help me, he cried. If Julius is not in the grave, where is he? And who? Holmes raised a hand. You will do nothing, said he. You will remain here. You will send a note to Mrs. Beddington that you are unwell and cannot call. You will not speak to the police unless Lestrade drags you by the collar. Meanwhile, Watson and I will go to Harrow. To the country house, I said. Holmes nodded. To the bed where Julius died, said he. To the doctor who certified him, and to the servant who poured the brandy. For whether Mr. Lyle has sinned or not, the murderer has profited by his fear and fear. Watson is the most convenient accomplice in London. Holmes insisted upon the earliest train, and it was still scarcely past noon when we found ourselves rattling out of London, the fog thinning into a low gray ceiling above the fields. There is a particular dreariness in the suburban country of winter hedges, like inkstrokes, wet furrows, and bare trees that seem ashamed of their own skeletons. Yet to Holmes the change of scene brought no relief, for his mind was already in Harrow, walking about a death chamber with noiseless feet. He sat with his chin upon his hand, staring at nothing, while I, with the habit of a medical man, rehearsed in my own thoughts the possible physical circumstances of Beddington's end. When at last we alighted and took a trap along muddy lanes. The house proved to be a modest villa set back from the road behind a laurel hedge, respectable rather than wealthy. A maid admitted us, pale and suspicious. But Holmes had that air of authority which opens doors more readily than warrants. And within minutes we were ushered into a parlor where a man awaited us, Dr. Arkwright. He was a broad, clean-shaven practitioner with the weathered face of one who drives in all seasons. And he rose with stiff politeness when Holmes gave his name. The doctor's eyes narrowed at once, as if he had hoped never to see that thin, hawk-like figure in his comfortable room. "I have already spoken to the police," said he. There was nothing unusual. Holmes's manner was bland. "Then you will have no difficulty repeating your account," said he. "Mr. Julius Beddington died on Monday night. You certified him. And yet on Tuesday he was buried in a coffin which appears to have been empty. I should like to know what you saw." The doctor's color rose. "Empty coffins are not my affair," he snapped. "I saw a dead man, and I signed accordingly." Holmes's gaze traveled over him with that cold accuracy which strips a man of his pretenses. "You saw a dead man whose face was covered," said he quietly. "Do not deny it. Your left cuff is stained with camphor and undertaker's habit. Not a doctor's, and your boots carry clay like a churchyard, not a sick-room." Arkwright started, and I saw the instant in which he realized that evasion was useless. "Very well," he said harshly. "The face was covered. Mr. Lyle requested it. He said the illness had altered him, and you agreed without examination." I demanded, unable to keep the professional indignation from my voice. The doctor shot me a look. "I examined what I could," he said. The chest, the pulse there was none, the eyes were closed. The man was dead. Holmes's tone remained mild. "Dead men do not object to a glance beneath a cloth," said he. "Living men do. But we will not quarrel over hypotheticals. Tell me of the servant who fetched you." "A fellow named Will Baines," said Arkwright. "Beddington's man. Been with him years." "Where is he now?" asked Holmes. The doctor hesitated. "Gone," he admitted. "Left the morning after. Said the widow dismissed him." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "The widow," he repeated. "Yet Mrs. Beddington was in London, was she not, and prostrate with grief? It is convenient when a servant disappears. Did you see the dispatch case?" Arkwright stiffened. "Dispatch case." "Do not play the innocent," said Holmes. And now the steel came through the velvet. "It was in the room on Monday afternoon and gone by 10. You were called after 10. Either you saw the room and noted its contents as any attentive doctor would, or you did not attend to your patient at all. Which is it?" The doctor's mouth worked. At last he blurted, "I saw it on the chair when I came in. Then Mr. Lyle shut the door and spoke to me in the passage. When I returned, it was gone." "And you asked no question," said Holmes. "He told me it was private," muttered Arkwright. "He is a solicitor." Holmes gave a short, contemptuous laugh. "Solicitors," said he, "have no monopoly upon privacy. Doctor, only upon documents." Holmes rose and walked to the bell-pull. Before Arkwright could protest, he rang. The maid appeared, startled, and Holmes's voice took on that genial, domestic tone which disarms servants as surely as it disarms criminals. "My dear girl," said he, "Dr. Watson and I have come about the late master. We should be obliged if you would tell us where Mr. Will Baines may be found." The maid's eyes widened. "Will, sir? He's gone to London." "To London?" Holmes echoed. "He said he had business at St. Etheldrada's," she blurted, and then clapped a hand to her mouth, frightened by her own honesty. Holmes's head turned very slowly toward Arkwright. "At St. Etheldrada's," he repeated. "The churchyard." The doctor's face had drained of color. "I know nothing of that," he whispered. Holmes leaned in, and his voice became almost kind. "You know enough to be afraid," said he. "Now, listen carefully. If you have been deceived, you may yet save yourself by helping us. Tell me, when you entered the sick room, did you notice any smell besides camphor?" Arkwright swallowed. "A sharp smell," he said, "like almonds bitter." My medical instincts sprang up. "Prussic acid," I cried. "Cyanide." Holmes's eyes flashed approval. "An almond odor," said he. "And yet Mr. Beddington was said to have died of heart failure. A convenient diagnosis when one wishes to avoid inquiry." We left the doctor sitting like a man struck by paralysis, and Holmes hurried me back into the trap with a quickness that was itself a confession of urgency. "Baines went to the graveyard," said he. "Therefore Baines is either victim or accomplice. And the almond smell suggests that Julius Beddington's death was not natural. Yet the world was shown a funeral without a corpse. Why? Because the corpse was needed elsewhere, or because the corpse was not Julius?" He stared ahead at the wet road, and for a moment I saw in his profile the fierce joy of the chase. "We must return to St. Etheldreda's before night," he said. "Lestrade will dig for a body and find none. The newspapers will howl. And in the confusion, the man called Stapleton Niff, that is his name, will attempt the next move. If we are late, Watson, we shall be playing catch-up with a murderer who thinks like a lawyer and moves like a soldier." Holmes found Baker Street in an uproar when we returned. For the affair had already slipped a leash of discretion and was running, baying. Through London, Mrs. Hudson met us at the door with her hands floury from some interrupted task. And behind her I heard the murmur of voices in our sitting-room, men's voices, impatient and official. Holmes' eyes brightened, not with surprise, but with that faint, disdainful amusement with which he greeted any development that proved human nature reliable. "The yard has arrived," said he, "and with it the illusion of progress." Inspector Lestrade sprang up as we entered, his lean face sharpened by indignation. A constable stood behind him, and with them a thick-set man in a black coat whose grave manner and ink-stained fingers proclaimed him to be from some office of record. "There you are," Lestrade cried. "I've been to St. Etheldreda's. I've had the grave opened under proper authority. Nothing there, Holmes. Not a bone, not a scrap of cloth. Empty as a money-box after payday. And now every scoundrel with a printing press will be screaming about resurrection and body snatchers." Holmes tossed his gloves upon the table as if the matter were no more than a missed appointment. "You found nothing because you looked for the wrong thing," said he. "Did you examine the coffin itself?" Lestrade bristled. "We broke it open," he snapped. "Solid wood. No secret compartments. The undertaker swears it left his shop sealed with the corpse inside." Holmes turned to the thick-set man. "And you?" he asked. The fellow cleared his throat. "Mr. Ames, sir," said he. "Registrar's office. There's been irregularity. The death certificate was filed in London, but signed in Harrow. That's not unknown, but the wording is odd. Cardiac failure with no mention of the consumption. And there is a blot where the date should be, as if the ink was touched before it dried." Holmes nodded as though a puzzle piece had clicked into place. "Thank you, Mr. Ames," said he. "That blot is more eloquent than most witnesses." Lestrade threw up his hands. "Eloquent. We have an empty coffin and a missing corpse. The widow's near mad. Lyle is barricaded in his chambers and refusing to answer. And now some crack-brained reporter has it that the sexton heard knocking from underground." Holmes' gaze flicked to me, and I saw the question in it. I answered with the briefest nod. The rumor had found its mark. "Knocking," Holmes murmured. "Yes, a melodrama to distract from a ledger." He paced once across the room, then stopped so abruptly that Lestrade fell silent mid-complaint. "Where is Crown and Shield?" Holmes asked. "The sexton." Lestrade frowned. "At the church, I suppose. Why?" Holmes' voice became as sharp as a whip crack. "Because he will not be there." Lestrade stared. "What do you mean?" Holmes was already at the desk, scribbling a line on a scrap of paper. "Watson, your coat," said he. "Lestrade, if you wish to do something useful, send your constable to St. Etheldrada's once to find Mr. Silas Crowninshield. If he is not at the church, look to the river steps nearest Holborn." Lestrade's face darkened. "You're guessing? I am deducing," Holmes replied. "The sexton knows the coffin was empty. Someone else knows he knows. And the man who leaned upon the rail after him is not a sentimental churchgoer." The constable was gone in a rush, and Holmes turned to Lestrade with an air almost conversational. "Tell me," said he, "did you notice the clay on your left boot before you visited me this afternoon?" Lestrade's eyes dropped involuntarily. "It's from the grave." "Precisely. And you leaned upon the rail with impatience. The other man leaned there with calculation. One leans to see what is, the other leans to see what was done. He came after Crownshield's nocturnal excavation to judge how much the fool had learned." Lestrade's jaw set. "Then who is he?" he demanded. "A man you will not find in your files," said Holmes. "Not under his real name." I could not help but marvel at Holmes' composure amid this gathering storm. He seemed, indeed, to thrive upon it. While Lestrade fretted over warrants and newspapers, Holmes moved to the mantel, selected his pipe, and filled it with slow precision. Yet his eyes, as he tamped the tobacco, were alive with inward calculation. "The essential point," he said at last, "is that Julius Beddington's death has been legally established while his body has been physically removed from the chain of evidence. That is not the act of a common thief. It is the act of a man who intends to use the idea of Julius Beddington as a tool dead to the world, but present where signatures matter. Signatures," I repeated. Holmes' gaze sharpened. "A solicitor," said he. "A dispatch case, ledgers, a codicil refused, money managed by a partner. Add to this an almond odor in the death room. A doctor who certifies without seeing a face, and a servant who goes to St. Etheldrada's. What do you make of it?" Lestrade scowled. "Blackmail, embezzlement, murder." Holmes nodded. "Yes, but also impersonation," said he softly. "A dead man may sign nothing, Watson, unless someone has arranged otherwise." At that instant there came a violent knocking at the door. Not the gentle tap of a caller, but the desperate hammering of a man pursued. Mrs. Hudson cried out. And before she could reach the latch, Holmes had crossed the room and flung it open. A young messenger in a peaked cap stumbled in, his face pinched with cold and fear. "For Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "from St. Etheldrada's." Holmes tore open the note. I saw his eyes run over it, saw the sudden stillness descend upon him, as if every muscle had become wire. He handed it to me without a word. It was from the constable Lestrade had dispatched. Written in a scrawl that wavered with haste: "Crowninshield not found. Church door ajar. Lantern smashed in the yard. Signs of a struggle by the tool shed. And on the wet stones by the gate fresh wheel marks, as from a handcart. Leading away toward the river." Lestrade snatched the paper, and for the first time his official anger was swallowed by something nearer to dread. "Damnation," he breathed. "He's been taken." Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "Taken or silenced," said he. "Come, Watson. Lestrade, you may yet have your body snatchers, but not in the way your imagination enjoys. Our murderer has moved his pieces. Now we move ours." Holmes took the riverward streets at a pace which forced Lestrade's constable into a half-run. And I, though no stranger to exertion, found my breath clouding in the cold as we passed beneath dripping archways and along shuttered shops, where the gas lamps burned like blurred yellow moons. The fog thickened again as we neared the fleet's old course, for the air there is forever heavy with damp and ancient refuse. Holmes walked with his head a little lowered, not from uncertainty, but from that habit of reading the ground as one reads a page. Twice he halted to examine the wheel marks which the constable's note had mentioned, and each time he did so with a rapidity which made the movement seem instinctive. Though I knew the mind behind it was counting inches, weighing pressure, and measuring the angle of escape. "A handcart," said Lestrade, staring down at the twin grooves which cut through the wet mud. "Any porter might have made them." "Any porter might," returned Holmes, "but not every porter leaves a track like this. Observe, the right wheel runs deeper. The axle is warped, or the load shifted to one side. That suggests a single heavy object badly balanced. A man's body, for example, bound and thrown across rather than laid straight. Now observe the outer edge of the grooves, see how it is scalloped. The wheel is not rubbered, bare iron. Such carts are more common with costermongers and undertakers than with respectable porters." Lestrade glanced at him sourly. "Undertakers again," he muttered. Holmes's thin lips tightened. "When a trade appears twice in a case, Lestrade, it is not coincidence. It is habit. Criminals, like honest men, work with what they know." We reached the river steps, a set of slippery stones descending into the blackness where the Thames moved unseen, gurgling against the wall like some sullen animal. A faint smell of tar and sewage rose with the mist. The constable pointed to a darker smear upon the stones. "There," said he. "Look at that." Holmes crouched and touched it with the tip of a finger. He sniffed, then rubbed it between finger and thumb. "Not blood," said he. "Tallow, perhaps, or axle fat." They paused here to adjust the load. And here he moved his lantern, and the light caught a scrap of coarse fiber lodged in the crevice of a step. He drew it out delicately. "Jute again," he murmured. My mind went back to the vestry boards, to the undertaker's clerk, to the heavy coffin whose lining was stiffened with the same rough sacking. "Then Crowninshield was wrapped," I said. "As the body was raptive body, it was." Holmes rose. "Or gagged with it," said he. "Jute is cheap, plentiful, and leaves a signature. Whoever planned this has used the same materials repeatedly. That means either carelessness or confidence. I suspect the latter." Lestrade peered into the fog above the water. "So they took him by boat." Holmes's eyes traveled along the river wall. "By boat, yes, but not from these steps," said he. "If they had launched here, there would be scuffing where the keel scraped, and the marks would angle toward the water. Instead, the tracks continue look along the parapet." He began to walk, and we followed, slipping once or twice on the slime-slick stones. 100 yards farther on, a darker shape loomed, a narrow wharf gate, half open, and beyond it the faint outline of a low shed and a moored lighter. A single lamp burned within the shed, dimmed by the fog, and the light moved as if someone passed before it. Holmes's hand closed on my sleeve. "Watson," said he, so softly that only I could hear, "the trap is not yet ours. We may be walking into theirs." He drew Lestrade aside with a quick gesture. "No shouting, no sudden rush," he murmured. "If they have Crowninshield alive, one foolish move will finish him. If they have already finished him, one foolish move will lose us the trail. You and your men will wait here. Watson and I will go forward as two curious pedestrians." Lestrade's pride rose. "And why you?" he hissed. "Because," said Holmes, with that cold civility which could cut deeper than insult, "I can play a part without announcing it." He pulled his collar higher, altered the set of his shoulders, and in an instant the famous figure was subtly transformed. The Scholar Hawk became a weary clerk with a cough and a shuffled step. I marveled once more at the completeness of his small deceptions. Together we went on, keeping to the deeper shadow of the wall until we reached the half-open gate. Holmes paused, stooped, and with a motion so quick I scarcely saw it, drew from his pocket a small pinch of something which he scattered upon the threshold. Later, I learned it was a powder of his own making, meant to show the print of any boot which crossed it. Within, the shed smelled of damp rope and old spirits. 2 men stood near a crate, their caps pulled low, speaking in hoarse undertones. Neither looked in our direction until Holmes gave a small, deliberate coffin, elderly, irritated sound. One of them turned, and the lamp lit his face, a sharp-featured fellow with a scar along his jaw. The other remained half in shadow, but I saw the set of his shoulders military. Rigid, and my thoughts went at once to Crownshield's tall, silent gentleman. "What do you want?" growled the scarred man. Holmes's voice, when he answered, was that of a man lower in station than his own wine of petty grievance. "Looking for Will Baines," said he. "Told me to meet him by the wharf. Said there'd be a job for a strong arm." At the name, the man in shadow shifted. He stepped forward, and the light caught his boot, polished, expensive. With a faint smear of Holborn clay on the left instep, Holmes did not glance at them. Not directly. Yet I saw his eyes, half-lidded, note everything. "Baines ain't here," said the tall man. His voice was controlled, educated, and deadly calm. "Go back where you came from." Holmes gave a little shrug, as if cowed. "All right," said he. "No harm meant." He turned, and I turned with him, my heart hammering, for we were within arm's reach of men who would not hesitate. Yet as we stepped back through the gate, Holmes stumbled on apparent clumsiness and his hand brushed the post as if to steady himself. It was so natural a movement that no one questioned it. We walked 50 yards before Holmes spoke again. "The post," he whispered. "There is fresh resin upon it. They have carried something sticky and heavy in and out coffin varnish, or sealed crates. And the man's boots confirm our friend Stapleton is no mere hireling. He is directing this operation, and Crowninshield?" I breathed. Holmes's jaw tightened. "Not in that shed," said he, "but nearby. The lighter is loaded, and they are preparing to move on the tide. Lestrade must seize the wharf quietly, and we must find where they have hidden the sexton before the river carries our answers out to sea." Lestrade moved at last with a quiet efficiency which, when it came, proved why the yard endured. I saw his constables melt into the fog-like shadows, their boots muffled with rags, their truncheons kept low, while he himself held back with clenched jaw and eyes fixed upon the wharf gate. Holmes, however, had already left the police to their proper work and was guiding me along the river wall in the opposite direction, keeping close to the ooze-dark bricks where the mist lay thickest. "They will expect pursuit toward the lighter," he whispered. "Therefore the thing we require is not on the lighter, at least, not yet. The man Stapleton has the mind of a campaigner. He will hold his prisoner inland until the last safe moment, then transfer him under cover of official commotion." "You speak as if you are certain Crowninshield still lives," I murmured. Holmes' answer was grim. If he were dead, they would have weighted him and dropped him already. A dead man is simpler than a living one. But a living man can be made to tell what he saw, and more importantly, what he did. Crowninshield opened that coffin, Watson. He may have left traces. He may have taken something without knowing it. They cannot risk uncertainty. The wall ended in a broken stretch where old steps once had been, now half collapsed and slick with slime. Beyond it stood a line of warehouses, their upper windows blind and their lower doors scarred by years of rope and cart. Holmes paused, sniffed, and smiled faintly on expression I had learned to fear, for it meant that some invisible sign had spoken clearly to him. "Carbolic," said he, "and tar. Undertaker's resin, again. But also fresh lime. They have been near here, with something that required quick, brutal cleanliness." He led me to a narrow alley between 2 buildings, so tight that our shoulders brushed brick. Halfway down it, a door stood ajar, its lock broken crudely, as if by a strong blade. Holmes raised his hand, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest as he drew his revolver and held it low along his thigh. He leaned to the crack, listened, then pushed the door inward. We entered a space which had once been an office. Judging by the remnants of a desk and the outline of a stovepipe against the wall, now it was bare, save for a coil of rope, a heap of sacking, and a lantern set upon the floor with its wick turned low. The air struck me first, sharp, bitter, and unmistakably medical. My mind leaped back to Harrow and the almond odor Arkwright had described. Here, too, there was that suggestion of bitter kernels beneath the stench of damp jute. Holmes crossed to the sacking and lifted it, with the delicacy of a surgeon raising a bandage. Underneath lay a man's Silas crown and shield bound at wrists and ankles. A strip of coarse cloth drawn tight across his mouth. His eyes rolled toward us in wild relief. I was at his side in an instant, my fingers upon his pulse. Oh, it was rapid and thready, but it was there. Alive, I whispered. Holmes' face did not soften. Of course, said he. They have not finished with him. As I cut the gag away, Crowninshield made a choking sound and tried to speak, but his tongue was swollen and his lips cracked. I gave him a sip from my flask, and he gulped it like a man in the desert. Mr. Holmes, he gasped at last, and? His voice broke. I tried to do as you said. I went back like nothing happened, but he came, the tall one, and another, with a scar. They said I'd been digging. I lied. He smiled. Then I felt a cloth sweet, bitter over my face, and the yard went away. Holmes crouched beside him. Did you see where they carried you? He asked. Crowninshield shook his head, trembling. Fog, sack over my head. I heard water, chains, and then voices. They talked of the papers and the case, and the widow. And he said, God strike me dead, he said. The funeral has served. Oh, we need the man. Holmes' eyes narrowed to slits. The man, he repeated. Not the body. Not the corpse. The man. That is interesting. Crowninshield clutched at my sleeve. Mr. Holmes, he whispered, there was a thing inside the coffin when I opened it. Not a body, no. But not empty neither. There was a weight, wrapped. And when I prized the lid, the weight was gone. Only the smell and the damp remained. But I found this in the lining. His bound hands fumbled at his waistcoat, and with difficulty he produced a small object which he had evidently hidden in desperation. A thin sliver of metal, curved like part of a clasp or hinge. Holmes took it, and the lamplight caught a tiny stamped mark upon it so small that I could not have read it without a lens. Holmes' mouth tightened in satisfaction. A maker's stamp, said he, from a dispatch case fitting. So Mr. Lyle spoke true about the case existing, yet he lied or was misled about its disappearance. It did not vanish into the air. It was transported under the sanctity of a funeral. A sound came, then faint, distant, yet unmistakable. A whistle, low and brief, like a signal on a night watch. Holmes' head snapped up. They are recalling their men, he said. Lestrade has moved. He helped me raise Crowninshield, and together we half carried, half supported him toward the alley door. At that moment a shadow fell across the crack of light, and the door began to push inward. From outside, with slow, confident pressure, Holmes moved like lightning. He set Crowninshield against the wall, his revolver up, his body between us and the door. The wood creaked. A thin blade slid into the gap, feeling for the latch. Stapleton. Holmes called softly. Your hand is steady, but your timing is poor. The blade paused. For a second there was complete stillness. Then the door was kicked in with a violence that sent the lanterns skittering. And in the sudden flare of light, I saw the tall man's face clearly for the first time, clean-shaven, pale, with eyes so calm they might have belonged to a statue. Behind him, the scarred fellow crowded, and beyond them, the fog and the alley were filled with the blur of running feet and shouted commands. Stapleton's gaze flicked to Crowninshield, and I saw the calculation in it, the instant weighing of whether to shoot, seize, or retreat. Holmes fired once, not to kill, but to command, and the bullet splintered the doorpost an inch from Stapleton's hand. The man did not flinch. He merely stepped back with the smoothness of a trained soldier, his lips curving in a faint, contemptuous smile. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and his voice was almost courteous, "you are persistent." "And you," said Holmes coldly, "are overconfident." Lestrade's men surged into the alley at that instant, truncheons raised. Stapleton turned, not in panic, but with a controlled economy of motion. And in the confusion of bodies and fog, he was suddenly gone as if the mist itself had swallowed him. The scarred man was less fortunate. 2 constables had him by the arms, and Lestrade, breathing hard, thrust his face close. "Got you?" the inspector snarled. Holmes did not look at the prisoner. His eyes were fixed on the empty space where Stapleton had stood. "No," said he softly. "We have not got him, but we have what he came for, and that means his next move is no longer hidden. Watson, see Crowninshield safe. Lestrade, hold your man. And send someone now to Mrs. Beddington. Tell her to admit no caller, no matter what voice he uses, because the funeral was only the beginning." Mrs. Beddington lived in a narrow, genteel street off Russell Square, in a house whose prim brick face and polished knocker proclaimed respectability, while the drawn curtains and the wreath upon the door spoke of grief. When we arrived, Crowninshield was already in my care, safely deposited at Baker Street with Mrs. Hudson hovering like a maternal sentinel. Holmes had wasted no time in sending me on before him, yet within minutes he appeared at my side as if London's fog were a curtain he could pass through at will. Lestrade, chastened and angry, had kept his men upon the river, but Holmes would not trust the widow's door to any constable's clumsy watchfulness. "A woman in mourning," said he, as we waited for the maid to answer, "is considered by society incapable of defending herself. Criminals share society's prejudices." A servant admitted us into a somber drawing-room, where the air was heavy with flowers and the faint sweetness of laudanum. Mrs. Beddington lay upon a couch, her veil thrown back, revealing a young face already sharpened by suffering. At her side sat a man of 30 or thereabouts, with restless eyes and the sullen hands of one who had never learned to be still. Holmes' gaze touched him and passed on, yet I felt the instant judgment in that glance. The man rose abruptly. "Who are you?" he demanded. "My sister is not to be pestered." "Mr. Edwin Harrowby, I think," said Holmes softly. The fellow started, then blustered. "And if I am," Holmes bowed. "Your reputation has preceded you," said he, "which is precisely why I am here." Mrs. Beddington struggled to sit up, her hands trembling. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "they said you would come." Horace said, her voice broke upon the name. And for an instant the mask of mourning slipped, showing something else beneath fear, certainly, but also a watchfulness too keen for a woman overwhelmed by grief. Holmes seated himself, his long fingers steepled. "Madam," said he, "your husband's burial was a deception. You may faint at the words if you wish, but I would rather you remain conscious, for your life may depend upon it." Harrowby swore and took a step forward, but Holmes' eyes pinned him. "Sit down," said he, not loudly, yet with such authority that the man obeyed almost despite himself. I watched Mrs. Beddington's face as Holmes spoke, and I saw no surprise, only a tightening at the corner of the mouth as of one who hears an expected blow. "You knew," I murmured involuntarily. She looked at me, and for a moment the sorrow. In her eyes seemed very real. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "They would not let me see Julius. They would not let me touch him. Horace said it would harm me." And then at the graveside those sounds, she shuddered. I thought I was losing my mind. Holmes leaned in. "Did a man call at this house today?" he asked. A tall man, clean-shaven, with the manner of a soldier. Harrowby answered before she could. "No one calls," he snapped. "I see to that." Holmes' gaze moved to the window. The curtain stirred, though no draft should have reached it. He rose in a flash, crossed the room, and with one swift motion threw the heavy cloth aside. The window was unlatched, and upon the sill lay a smear of damp clay. "He has been here," said Holmes. Harrowby's face went a mottled red. "That's nonsense," Holmes cut him short. "It is your nonsense that will kill your sister," said he. "He came not to be received, but to listen. And now that he knows I am involved, he will come again, this time to act." Mrs. Beddington's breath came in short gasps. "Why?" she whispered. "What does he want from me?" Holmes' voice softened a fraction. "Your husband's name," said he. "And what a dead man can do when a clever rogue lends him a hand. Transfer money, sign papers, and silence those who suspect." He turned abruptly upon Harrowby. "Where is the dispatch case your brother-in-law kept?" he demanded. Harrowby stared, then gave a harsh laugh. "Ask Horace Lyle," he said. "He took everything. He'd steal the shroud off the corpse if he could." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "You are lying," said he. "Not well either. Your right hand is ink-stained. Though you claim to do no writing, you have been handling papers. Your cuff bears a trace of camphor. You have been near undertakers' preparations or near the thing they wrapped to resemble a corpse." The man's bravado drained. His gaze flicked to Mrs. Beddington, and in it I saw a crude desperation. "I only wanted what was due," he muttered. "Julius hated me. He'd leave my sister a pittance and give the rest to beggars. Horace said there were papers Julius meant to sign that would ruin us all. He said a man Stapleton could set it right. I never saw Stapleton. I only passed a note. I swear it." Mrs. Beddington gave a low cry, half sob, half laugh. "Edwin," she whispered, "what have you done?" Holmes' face was bleak. "You have done what weak men always do," said he. "You have invited a stronger villain into your house, and imagined you could control him." He strode to the door and spoke to the maid, his tone brisk and precise. "Lock the front door. Bar the back. No one enters. If any man claims to bring a message from Mr. Lyle, you will show him into this room and then leave at once." He returned to us. "Watson," said he, "stand by the lamp. Lestrade's men will not arrive in time. We must make our own net." It was then that the bell rang one long peal, perfectly timed, as though the finger upon it knew the very rhythm of our hearts. The maid's footsteps sounded in the hall, hesitant. Holmes' hand went to his pocket, and I heard the faint click of metal as he thumbed back the revolver's hammer. A voice came through the door. Calm, cultivated, and unmistakably familiar. "A message for Mrs. Beddington," it said. "From Mr. Horace Lyle." Holmes' eyes met mine, and in them there was that fierce, controlled light which always came to him at the instant of danger, as if peril were the atmosphere in which his mind breathed most freely. Now he whispered. The door opened. The tall man stepped in, hat in hand, his boots immaculate despite the fog. He smiled as a courteous stranger might smile upon entering a drawing-room, till his gaze fell upon Holmes. For the briefest instant the mask slipped, and I saw the hard edge beneath. "Mr. Holmes," said Stapleton softly, "you are even more troublesome than I was told." "And you," said Holmes, "are precisely where I wished you." Stapleton's hand moved not toward a weapon, but toward the widow, quick as a striking snake. Holmes sprang. I fired, and the shot shattered the plaster above Stapleton's shoulder. He recoiled, not in pain, but in surprise. And in that heartbeat, Lestrade's heavy tread thundered on the stairs outside, followed by the crash of boots and the barked commands of policemen who had at last found their way to the right door, Stapleton's. Eyes flicked to the window, the unlatched window with the clay smear, and I understood with a sick certainty that he had prepared his escape before he ever rang the bell. He gave Holmes a thin smile, almost one of admiration, and then he was gone in a blur of movement. Diving through the open sash into the fog below, Holmes ran to the window and looked down. When he turned back, his face was set. "He will not run far," said he, "but he will run far enough to attempt the final act. Come, Watson. The man we have not yet found is the one who can truly sign Julius Beddington's name." Holmes led us from Russell Square with the speed of a man who has at last seen the whole pattern and now races only to prevent the final stitch being drawn. Lestrade's men fanned behind, their boots striking sparks from the wet stones, while the fog swallowed the lamplight and gave back only pale halos in which faces swam and vanished. "He will not attempt to flee London," Holmes said over his shoulder. "A man like Stapleton does not run from a winning position. He runs toward the last necessary move." I asked what move remained, for to my mind he had already risked everything. Holmes's answer came like the click of a lock. "A signature," said he, "or the destruction of the one witness who can deny it." We reached Lincoln's Inn Fields again, and Holmes did not go to the front entrance of Beddington and Lyle, where clerks and police might be expected, but to a side passage that opened upon the service stair. There he halted, studied the ground, and smiled thinly. A single cart track cut through the slush urn, rimmed the right wheel deeper than the left. "Our warped axle," he murmured. "Stapleton has already been here. He has brought something in or taken something out, and he has done it by the servant's way. Because pride makes clerks blind, and fear makes servants silent." He rapped once upon the side door with the knuckles of a tradesman, and when it opened to reveal a frightened maid, he stepped past her as though he owned the building. The corridor smelt of ink, damp wool, and that peculiar sourness which clings to paper shut away too long. We climbed quickly. At the second landing, Holmes stopped before a door whose panel bore a fresh scratch, as if a key had been turned in haste. He laid his ear against it, motioned for silence, then drew back and struck it with his shoulder. The lock splintered, and we burst into Lyle's private office. Horace Lyle sat in his chair, upright, his hands upon the arms, as if in rigid composure. Yet the pose was a mockery, for his eyes were wide and fixed, and at the corner of his mouth a thread of saliva glistened. On the desk before him lay a glass tipped upon its side, and the air was heavy with that bitter almond scent which no doctor can mistake. I was at him in an instant, my fingers searching for a pulse, my mind already counting seconds. "Poison," I said. Cyanide. Holmes's hand caught my wrist. "Too late," he murmured. "Look at his lips." I had seen death enough upon battlefields not to flinch, yet there was something peculiarly chilling in this neat murder conducted amid law books and polished brass. Lestrade swore under his breath and turned away, but Holmes stepped to the desk and began to examine it with a calmness that bordered upon cruelty. He lifted the fallen glass, sniffed it, set it down, then turned to the blotter. "He wrote," said he, "or someone wrote for him." He held up a sheet of paper, still damp at one edge. Upon it was a short note in a firm, slanting hand. A confession of embezzlement, a plea for mercy, and a final line begging that Mrs. Beddington accept Lyle's sorrow. Lestrade seized it eagerly. "That's your motive," he cried. "He killed himself, Holmes, over his guilt." Holmes's eyes flicked to the ink. "Guilt writes in tremors," said he. "This is too steady for a man with death in his mouth. And see here, Watson, the margin." I looked, and my breath caught. In the left margin, where the writer's hand must have rested, the paper was faintly smudged with a greasy line tallow, like that upon the river steps. Holmes nodded. "The same hand that handled the cart handled this," said he. "Wrote the confession. He needed Lyle dead, and he needed Lyle disgraced, so that no one would question what followed. He crossed to the safe set into the wall behind a painting, and to my astonishment he did not fumble. He placed his fingers upon the dial and turned it with quick certainty. "You cannot know," Lestrade began. "I do not know," Holmes interrupted. "I infer. Lyle, being a solicitor, chose numbers meaningful to him. The date of the firm's founding, perhaps, or his child's birthday. But a man who has just been threatened with public exhumation will change his combination. Therefore the correct combination is the old one and change, because he had no time to alter it." The safe clicked open. Inside lay ledgers, a packet of bonds, and most important a dispatch case of worn leather, its brass clasps bright. Holmes lifted it as a priest might lift a relic. "The case," he said. "Julius's case. And now we shall see why a funeral was staged without a corpse." He opened it, and within were papers bundled in jute-lined envelopes, each sealed with dark resin. One bore a name which made even Lestrade draw a sharp breath: a bank, a trust, and a sum so large that it explained at once why men would kill without hesitation. Another packet contained a letter in Julius Beddington's hand, accusing Horace Lyle of a fraud so intricate that it involved not only embezzlement but the forging of wills and the use of a living double to sign in the name of the dead. "A living double," I repeated, stunned. Holmes's face was set like stone. "The man we have not yet found," said he. "Not Stapleton, but the instrument he uses. A man who resembles Julius closely enough, at least in the dark and under a cloth, to deceive an obliging doctor. A man who can be warmed with a hot bladder, wrapped to hide his face, and placed in a coffin so that witnesses may swear a body was there. A man who, once the world believes Julius dead, can sit somewhere private and sign away the fortune." He snapped the case shut. "And now, Watson, we must go where such signing would be most useful." We drove at once to the bank named in the papers, Holmes forcing Lestrade into the cab with a pressure of will that allowed no argument. The streets seemed to conspire against us, carts, cabs, and crowds, yet, when we arrived, Holmes did not storm the door. He became suddenly leisurely, even foppish, as if the matter were an idle errand. "Stapleton will not enter like a thief," he said. "He will enter like a gentleman with authority." He sent in Lestrade's men to the side, while he and I waited in the public hall among clerks and clients. The minutes dragged, and I felt every one of them like a nail. At last a figure appeared at the far end of the hall, escorted by a bank manager. He was thin, stooped, his face half hidden by a scarf, as though from a lingering illness. Yet the moment his eyes lifted, I felt the strange shock of resemblance, the aquiline line, the hollow cheeks. Julius Beddington, or something close enough to chill the blood. Beside him walked Stapleton, immaculate and calm, his hand resting lightly upon the other man's elbow as though guiding an invalid. The manager was speaking in reassuring tones. "Of course, Mr. Beddington, just a formality if you will sign here." Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Beddington," said he, clearly, "you have been dead for 3 days." The stooped man froze. Stapleton's eyes flashed, and in that instant the whole room seemed to tighten like a drawn bowstring. Lestrade surged from the side with his men, truncheons raised. Stapleton moved as if to bolt, but Holmes was quicker. He had already placed himself so that the only clear path led straight into the arms of the police. The false Beddington gave a strangled cry and clutched at his chest. Not in illness, but in panic, and as he did so, his scarf slipped. I saw then, beneath the jawline, a faint seam of discolored skin makeup, or a crude alteration meant to sharpen the likeness. Stapleton's calm cracked into fury. "You meddling devil," he hissed. Holmes's reply was quiet. "No," said he, "merely a logical one." Stapleton's fury was the last honest thing I was ever to see upon his face. In an instant it was smoothed away, replaced by that composed civility which, in my experience, is the most dangerous mask a man may wear. Yet the veins at his temple stood out, and I observed that the hand with which he adjusted his glove trembled. Once before he mastered it. The bank hall had fallen into a startled hush, clerks half risen from their stools, gentlemen with pens suspended over ledgers, the manager staring as if the dead had indeed walked in. Lestrade's men closed in, and the false Beddington, pressed suddenly between uniformed shoulders and the marble counter, began to whimper in a thin, animal way, his eyes darting from face to face in search of some mercy which no one had any reason to grant him. Holmes did not look at Stapleton at all. His gaze was upon the sham invalid. "Your scarf has slipped," said he, almost kindly. "Do you find it difficult to breathe in another man's skin?" The fellow clapped both hands to his throat, as though the very words tightened the cloth there. "I don't know what you mean," he stammered. "My name is Silence," said Holmes, and the single word rang with such quiet authority that the man choked off his lie. Holmes turned then to the bank manager, whose face had gone from outrage to terror in the space of a minute. "You have been on the point of witnessing a fraud," said Holmes. "I would advise you to send at once for your senior partner and to place a clerk at every door. This man is not Julius Beddington, though he has been dressed to appear so. Mr. Julius Beddington is dead." The manager found his voice with a sort of squeak. "Dead. But this gentleman is an actor," said Holmes. "And the other is his prompter." He nodded toward Stapleton, who now stood with his shoulders slightly hunched, as though already measuring distances and possibilities. "Lestrade," Holmes continued, "take Stapleton first. The double will collapse without him." Lestrade, eager to redeem the morning's humiliation, sprang forward. Stapleton allowed the constable's hands to touch his arms, and for a heartbeat I believed he submitted. Then his knee came up like a piston, striking the nearest man in the thigh, and the bank hall erupted into shouts. A woman screamed. Tess clattered. Stapleton twisted free with the practiced violence of one trained to break holds, and he flung a handful of something fine as dust into the air. It was a trick as old as the stage and as effective as gunfire. The powder burst into a stinging cloud which made eyes water and throats close. Men reeled back, coughing, blind for precious seconds. Holmes had anticipated it. Before Stapleton's hand even rose, Holmes had stepped, not backward, but sideways, into the gap between two pillars, drawing me with him by the sleeve. "Keep your eyes low," he murmured. "He will run to the light." Through the tears upon my lashes, I saw Stapleton's shadow leap toward the entrance, only to meet two constables who had barred it. He swerved at once, not hesitating, for hesitation is death to such men, and went instead for a side corridor marked private. Holmes was after him with a speed that astonished me, his long legs eating the distance, his coat flaring like a black wing. I followed, revolver in hand, the manager and half the bank staff trailing in a panic behind. The corridor led to a narrow service stair, and upon those steps the fog of powder thinned, leaving only the sound of boots and harsh breathing. Stapleton was above us, already near the top, when Holmes spoke again. No shout, no threat, merely a statement flung like a net. "You cannot go out by the roof," said he. "I have men at the rear door." Stapleton glanced down, and for the first time his composure wavered. In that instant, Holmes sprang, caught the man's ankle, and dragged him back one step. Stapleton kicked violently, the heel of his boot grazing Holmes's cheek and drawing a thin red line upon the pale skin. Holmes did not release. He bore the pain as he bore everything without complaint, with a cold, inexorable persistence. Together they crashed against the wall, and my heart lurched as I saw Holmes's head strike the plaster. Yet even then his grip held. Lestrade arrived with his men like a wave. Truncheons rose and fell, hands seized. Stapleton was pinned, twisting and spitting curses, which became, at last, only a hoarse rasp of breath, when he could move no more. Holmes stepped back, wiping the blood from his cheek with a handkerchief, and regarding the prisoner with that detached curiosity with which a scientist regards a dangerous specimen newly bottled. "You will regret this," Stapleton panted. Holmes's eyes were very clear. "I regret only wasted time," said he. "Which brings us to the one question that matters. Where is Julius Beddington's body?" Stapleton's smile returned, faint and contemptuous. "Under the earth," he said. "In a grave, perhaps. Or in the river. London is full of places." Holmes's expression did not alter, but I saw his mind move, swift and sure. He turned from Stapleton to the trembling double, who had been dragged in by two clerks and now crouched upon the stair like a whipped animal. "You," said Holmes, "your name, your trade. And if you lie, I assure you the Yard will find reasons to keep you very uncomfortable." The man burst into tears. "My name's Jonah Pike," he sobbed. "I was a music hall extra. They said I looked like him, like the solicitor. They said it was only to frighten a partner and get papers back. I never meant." Holmes cut him short. "Who covered your face at Harrow?" Pike shuddered. "Stapleton, he painted me. He put the scarf and the cloth. He told the doctor not to look, and the coffin. We put the case in it," Pike blurted. "The dispatch case. Heavy, so they'd think there was a body. We had hot bottles wrapped in jute to make it warm, and a little clockwork tapper inside the lid so it would knock when it went down. Stapleton said folk believe what they fear." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And Julius Beddington?" he demanded again. Pike's sobbing became a moan. "I never saw him," he whispered. Only a bundle once, in sacking, carried to the wharf. They said it was the sexton at first, but it was before the sexton was taken. It was heavy, and it smelled bitter. The almond smell, cyanide. My stomach turned, not from the thought of death, but from the neatness of the method." Holmes closed his eyes for a brief instant, as though confirming some final step in his chain. "Lestrade," said he, "you will take Pike as a witness, not merely a prisoner. Stapleton has killed Horace Lyle with cyanide to close a mouth and forge a confession. He has staged a burial to move a dispatch case under public eyes. He has used a double to obtain signatures. The only remaining uncertainty is the location of Julius Beddington's body. I fear the Thames has already received it." He looked at Stapleton once more. "You chose the river because it erases. It does not. It only delays." Stapleton said nothing, but his silence had altered. It was no longer contempt. Was calculation again an inward measuring of what could still be saved? Holmes saw it, and, with that sudden change of tone, which in him was more alarming than anger, spoke almost conversationally. "You have made one error," said he. "You returned to Mrs. Beddington's window to listen. Men who listen cannot resist speaking when the moment comes. You will speak again, Stapleton, to the one person you still believe you can control." He turned to me as we descended the stair. "Watson," said he, "we shall not end this at the bank. We shall end it in the widow's drawing-room, with all doors watched and every shadow measured. Stapleton's last resort will be to bargain with her, threaten, cajole, or attempt to retrieve what he thinks she possesses. And there, he added, his eyes hardening, we shall offer him something he cannot refuse: the illusion of escape. Night had fallen upon Russell Square, and the fog lay so thick among the bare branches that the lamp seemed to burn inside. Yellow cocoons. Holmes had arranged the widow's drawing room with as much care as a stage manager, the curtains half drawn so that a man at the window would be silhouetted. The lamp turned low so that faces could be read, yet corners remained. Treacherous. The doors locked, yet not bolted, so that any forcing would proclaim itself in sound. Lestrade's men were placed not in the room, or their bulk and impatience would betray the ambush, but in the passage below and at the rear mews, with strict orders to move only on a whistle from Holmes. As for Mrs. Beddington, she sat very straight upon the couch, her hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles shone white through the lace. Grief had hardened into a kind of desperate courage, and when Holmes told her in plain words that a man might come that night to threaten her, she did not faint or weep, but only asked, "Will it end him, Mr. Holmes?" To which he answered, "It will end his freedom. Whether it ends him depends upon his own choices." Harrowby had been removed, protesting, to the kitchen under guard. Holmes would not have a weak man's panic spoiling a strong man's plan. I remained by the lamp as he had directed, my revolver within reach but out of sight, and I confess that, despite all my campaigning, the waiting tried my nerves more than the pursuit had done. Holmes sat in the shadow of the mantel, his long body relaxed, his eyes half closed. Yet I knew by the faint lift of his nostrils and the stillness of his hands that he was listening to the very texture of the silence. Once only he spoke, and then so softly that I scarcely heard. "He will come," said he. Men like Stapleton cannot bear to lose the last thread. They must tug it once more to see if it will hold. It was nearly 11 when the first sign came, not a knock, but the faintest rasp at the window latch. Mrs. Beddington's breath caught. I felt my own spine stiffen. Holmes's eyes opened, bright and cold. The curtain stirred, and a shadow slid between the folds. There was a pause, as if the man outside tested the room with his ears before trusting it with his eyes. Then the window eased upward, soundless, and Stapleton stepped in with the smooth assurance of one who has entered by stranger routes than doors. He wore no hat. His hair was damp with fog. His face, however, was perfectly composed, and when he saw Mrs. Beddington, he gave a little bow, as though calling upon her in daylight. "Madam," he said, "forgive the intrusion. Necessity makes its own etiquette." Mrs. Beddington's voice, when it came, was thin but steady. "You murdered my husband," she said. Stapleton spread his hands. "Your husband is beyond injury," he returned. "It is the living who must be practical." Holmes spoke from the shadow. "Practicality, Mr. Stapleton, is merely crime without poetry." Stapleton's head turned, and for the first time I saw a genuine flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Holmes," he said, "you are like damp in a house always where you are least wanted." "And you," Holmes answered, stepping forward, "into the lamplight are like vermin always where you have no right to be." Stapleton smiled faintly. "We might exchange compliments all night," said he, "but time presses. Madam, I am here to offer you safety. You have something that belongs to me." Double quotes. Mrs. Beddington looked bewildered. "I have nothing." "You have your husband's name," said Stapleton, and the civility in his voice hardened into something metallic. "A widow may do many things with a name. She may authorize, she may release, she may confirm. A signature from you, madam, will smooth certain complications which have arisen due to unfortunate interference." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You mean due to your arrest at the bank, your failed poisoning of the solicitor you intended to scapegoat, and the collapse of your little theater company," said he. "Yes, I can imagine it has been inconvenient." Stapleton's gaze flicked to me for a fraction, and I understood that he had taken the measure of the room, the distances, the lamp, the line to the window, the placement of furniture. "Interference can be removed," he said softly. "Am not without resources." Mrs. Beddington's courage wavered, and she pressed a hand to her throat. "What do you want me to sign?" she whispered. Holmes answered for him. "Nothing that will endure in law," said he. "Only something that will buy him time. He is cornered, madam, and cornered men become inventive. He wants you frightened enough to do what he says before help arrives." Stapleton's smile vanished. "Help," he repeated, and there was a dangerous amusement in it. "Yes, I have always found that the promise of help makes people reckless." He reached into his coat, and my hand tightened upon my revolver. But he did not draw a pistol. He drew instead a small glass vial, held it up to the lamplight so that the liquid within glittered. "Bitter," he said quietly. "You have smelt it already in this affair. It works quickly, and it leaves the world tidy. Now, madam, you will do as I ask." Holmes's voice was mild. "And if she refuses—" Stapleton's eyes remained upon Mrs. Beddington. "Then she will join her husband in being beyond injury." I saw Mrs. Beddington's lips part, and I thought she might break. Yet in that moment Holmes did a thing which I had never before seen him do in any case. He stepped closer, not to Stapleton, but to the widow, and spoke to her with a gentleness that was almost awkward in him. "Madam," said he, "you have been used as a prop in other men's schemes. Would you like for once to be the lever?" She stared at him. "How?" Holmes inclined his head toward the writing desk. "You will sign," said he. "You will sign exactly what I tell you. And while you sign, Watson and I will observe how Mr. Stapleton watches your hand." Stapleton's eyes sharpened. "Clever," he murmured. "But you forget I can simply take the paper." Holmes's reply was immediate. "No," said he. "You forget, Mr. Stapleton, that you are not alone." He raised a small whistle to his lips and blew one so soft a note that it seemed part of the night itself. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Stapleton's eyes widened, and he sprang for the window. But as he did so, the drawing-room door burst open, and Lestrade's men poured in, truncheons ready. Stapleton spun, his back to the wall, the file still in his hand. His gaze flicked from face to face, and I saw the instant calculation of whether to fight, poison, or leap. Holmes stepped forward, utterly calm. "Drop it," said he. Stapleton's smile returned, thin and bitter. "You never did tell me," he said, "where Julius Beddington lies." Holmes's eyes were like steel. "In the river," said he. "Weighted, wrapped in jute, carried on your warp-taxle cart to the wharf. And when the Thames gives him back, as it often does, your cleverness will be measured in the dock by a jury of ordinary men. That is the true humiliation for you, Stapleton, not being beaten by me, but being judged by them." For the first time, Stapleton's composure broke into something like rage, and he flung the file toward Holmes's face. I fired. The shot took the glass in midair, and it burst in a spray that spattered harmlessly upon the hearthstone. Stapleton lunged, but Lestrade's men were upon him. In the struggle, he struck one constable with a ferocity born of despair, yet the weight of bodies dragged him down at last, his fine boots kicking uselessly against the rug. When it was over, Mrs. Beddington sat very still, staring at the broken glass upon the stones as if she had seen her own death shattered there. Lestrade wiped his brow, breathing hard, and looked at Holmes with a grudging admiration. "Well," he said, "you've got him at last." Holmes was already turning away, his interest in Stapleton fading the moment the man ceased to be a problem. "We have," said he. "And yet we have not restored a life, only prevented another loss." Later, in Baker Street, with the fire. Bright and the fog held at bay by curtains and comfort, Holmes stood with his hands behind his back, staring into the flames. "It is curious," said he at last, "how much of crime depends upon the ordinary decencies. A coffin, a widow's veil, a doctor's certificate, these are the very things meant to make death bearable, and so they become the easiest tools to counterfeit." He glanced at me, and there was in his eyes a rare weariness. "Write it as you please, Watson," he added. "Only do not make me a hero. Heroes are men who enjoy the result. I enjoy only the reasoning." And so this singular affair ended, with a woman left to mourn not merely a husband, but the knowledge that his last days had been turned into a stage, with a partner dead of poison and cowardice, with a villain in irons who had believed himself, and with Holmes already drifting in thought toward some new puzzle, as indifferent to praise as he was hungry for truth.